Hi there, everybody. It's Jenny Clark, the GovCon CFO. My company is Solvability, and I work with small businesses in federal contracting so they can stop guessing and start knowing. And what I want them to start knowing is about their indirect rates that they're using for pricing to make sure that they understand how they're calculated and how they change. So I've had other videos where I've talked about fringe, overhead, and G&A, and I've shown you a structured chart of accounts that has revenue, direct labor, sections for fringe, for overhead, for G&A, and then down at the bottom is unallowable cost. And what I've done with this methodology that I'm using for a statement of indirect expenses is I take all the costs related to fringe benefits, I put them in this fringe pool column. I take the fringe base, which is direct labor plus overhead labor plus G&A labor, and I calculate that. Down to the bottom, I've got a calculation that takes the fringe pool over the base. It gives me 21.58%. And then I allocate or apply the fringe to direct labor, to overhead labor, and to G&A labor. So these lines. They get carried to other pools, is what I'm trying to say. Those allocations roll. Next, I have my overhead pool. Here are my overhead costs. Those overhead costs in the overhead pool include the amount of fringe related to that overhead labor. So I've got 93,000 in overhead cost, which is the support cost of your technical workforce, divided by 4.6 million of overhead base. The overhead base is direct labor plus the fringe applied to that direct labor. There's a couple other ways to calculate it, but this is the one I see most prevalent, so that's what I used. Next, I have my G&A or my corporate expense, and my G&A pool is made up of G&A labor and other expenses. I've got the fringe applied to G&A labor. So my G&A pool is 575,000. My G&A base, which is direct labor, plus fringe on direct labor, plus overhead applied to direct labor, plus direct travel, direct material, direct subs, unless you have subcontract handling, material handling. That's in my G&A base. And they're all itemized in this G&A base column. My G&A is 12%. 575 divided by 4.8 million is 12%. My model is made so that I have checks and balances built into it. And I work with companies on identifying, hey, what are your indirect rates? And a lot of them will have accounting software that will calculate it, but they never really understood how the math worked. And this model I built because when I was setting up that accounting software, I needed a simple way to check and make sure that I'd set up their indirect rates correctly to do these calculations because they're very important. What I want to talk about next, though, is the impact of your indirect rates and being able to manage to them. I want to talk about services company, professional services are providing labor to the federal government to deliver those services. We call that direct labor, billable labor. And one of the keys to making money in federal contracting is understanding how to balance what's called labor utilization. Direct labor is billable, right? You take the direct labor of the employees that are working on that, you build it up and you do an invoice at the end of the month for what they've done. So if you don't have enough direct labor, nobody's invoiced. You don't have money coming in. So I'm just going to type in here the types of labor we're talking about: overhead labor, G&A labor. I can just pull those from these columns. I call this productive labor. Many years ago, when I started my first job, I would have to fill out my timesheet, and I'd put down I wasn't charging to a client, and they'd go, well, that's non-productive. I'm like, well, what do you mean? I'm productive. I'm doing my job and doing what I'm supposed to do, but that's not how they considered it. So non-productive labor always stuck with me, and I call this productive labor, which is billable labor. And we're going to take that billable labor, we're going to mark it up, and then we're going to get to this $5 million, which is going to cover 3.8 million plus fringe, plus overhead, plus G&A, plus fee. That's how we make money in government contracting, right? That's where our profit comes from. Okay, I'm calling all of this labor utilization. Okay, I've actually connected the spreadsheet to another tab that I'm going to show you just a minute. It's called labor utilization. It's a list of all the employees in the company, their pay rates, their annual salary divided by 2080, 52 hours a week times 40 hours. That's their pay rate. And then what I did is I looked at them and I said, okay, who charges to direct labor? Who charges to overhead? Who charges to G&A? And when I go classify that, these percentages are going to change a bit. I'll put this over here. My direct labor as a percentage of the total productive labor is 89%. And then I can take that same formula. So right now, my G&A labor is 9%. My direct labor is 89%. Okay. So what happens as companies grow? Sometimes they have to invest in infrastructure. They start growing and they have to hire more accountants to do more billings. They have to put in accounting software. That gets expensive. Those things are all part of G&A. They have to hire more people in business development to go after more growth to keep this growth engine going. That usually goes in G&A. So there's a trade-off and there's a balance you have to keep an eye on to be able to make sure that you're not spending more money on overhead and G&A to get more contracts than you've got billable work coming in. There's so many things in government contracting that we don't have any control over. And that could be that we are working on a bid, we submitted the bid, it was supposed to be awarded in September, it's never awarded, it's canceled. Or you have a follow-on and you've got an option year and you thought they'd be exercised and they weren't. A lot of things that aren't under your control at all. And so that's why having an idea of where things are financially is so important so that the executive of the company can make decisions when things go up or when they don't go up as fast as you want them to. Okay, so labor utilization, that's really how much of our productive labor is spent in overhead and G&A because we want billable labor. Okay, so I've got this labor utilization, and actually it's tied into the other financial statement. So when I change this number, when I change any of these numbers, it's going to affect those indirect rates. So let's just pretend that the CEO of the company, um, his pay rate increases, and I'm just going to make it increase a lot. That is going to affect my indirect rates. I went from 12% to 13.5%. And it could be that was a bonus. It doesn't really matter. I'm just trying to show you the underlying math. You have to learn how this all works. I'm just going to hit undo. We're going back to where we were at 12% G&A. Okay, I've got built into this that I've got a bunch of new hires and they're starting now. Well, what happens if they don't start until later in the year, or They were supposed to start in March and they don't start till September. That's going to have an impact. And I can't really show you that level of impact with what we're doing today. I just wanted to show you that the ratio of direct to indirect employees is very important. So let me just zero these guys out. G&A went to 16.41%. Because I don't have as many billable people, my revenue would have also dropped down, which means my profit went down. I overran my rates. There's so many ways that this affects us. Okay, let's go back to the labor utilization. I'm going to hit undo a bunch of times, put us back to where we were. Let's pretend that the way that I'm controlling this is I've got columns here for what I call charging practices. We just hired somebody. What did they charge to? We just hired them. Well, they're in human resources. Well, human resources is G&A, so that's a charging practice. They will charge to G&A. Overhead. I might have somebody that's a program manager, and we have realized that because we've got more projects coming in, that project program manager is less available for direct labor and has to work more on overhead. Very good. He managed the customer and managed the projects. We need that project. We need his activity. I'm just going to say he comes completely off direct, make him zero here. He's now 91% on overhead. Program management to me is an overhead function because it's closely related to the contract activity we have. Let's go see what happens to our rates when we do that. Our overhead went from 2% to 5%. It's not as bad as G&A jumping up, but it still has an impact. So let's hit undo. Whoop. Labor utilization is affecting how those indirect rates change. And if you think about it, you're hiring people all the time. People are leaving to go on to different jobs. Contracts end, contracts start. Having a dynamic methodology to track what's going on in your company so you can correctly predict what your fringe, overhead, and G&A are and manage to that. How you can balance the ratio of your billable people to your indirect people, because the billable people bring in the revenue and perform the services for your government customers, but you still have to have back office people doing the billing, onboarding employees, doing recruiting, looking at the strategy of the company, doing the business development. All of those things are important, but understanding how it affects your indirect rates is important too, because if you don't know what those are, and you overrun them, you spend more than you intended. That's profit not coming into your company. So this is a way that it affects your pricing. And you want to make sure that if you're expecting a lot of growth, you create a pricing model for that proposal that explains how your indirect rates are going to be impacted. Well, thank you so much for listening. I'm Jenny Clark. I want to help you understand how indirect rates operate. I call this stop guessing and start knowing, because I think everybody will understand the holiday. What are we going to use for the rates on this proposal? Just use what we did on the last proposal. When you're big, that's probably right. When you're small, it takes a little bit more strategy and thought. And we want to put models in place while you're small so you can understand how this works, so that when you get a little bit bigger and you have software that does this for you, you're like, I know how to drive this car. I know exactly where we're going because I understand the math behind it. So you can reach me at Jenny, Jenny, at solvability.com. You can certainly find me on LinkedIn, Jenny W. Clark. My company is Solvability, solvability.com. Would love to chat with you if you're looking for how to solve this problem of, I know this is what we're bidding, but I'm not sure what our rates are.